everyone, good morning and welcome to our DAT IQ weekly market update. We're back and at full force here with our typical setup and hopefully free from all technical errors. I'm Ken Adamo, Chief of Analytics at DAT, joined by Ned Damon, who's our Principal Data Scientist, and Dean Croak, who's our Principal Industry Analyst. Good morning, guys. Sorry.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, Ken. Good to have you back.
Well, yes. Hey, I'm tanned. I'm somewhat relaxed as you can be, vacationing with your both sides of the family and 3 kids, but ready to rock and roll here and do some freight data analytics. How about you guys?
Yeah, lots to talk about today.
Yeah, oh boy.
Yeah, quite a bit going on. So just some housekeeping items early on. I'll remind everyone at the end of the show as well. Please drop your questions in the chat or comment section below. We have marketing folks who will get those over to us. And I know folks who may have tuned in over the last 2 weeks between some technical difficulties and things like that may not have gotten their questions answered. So please drop those below. And then also, I will be doing a webinar with the TIA at lunchtime East Coast here. So that'd be 12 noon Eastern time. It'll be 5 strategies, maybe a 6th, we'll never know, for winning more RFPs. So that will be hosted by the TIA. I'll be doing that live with Q&A. You could just head over to our LinkedIn page. I think it's promoted over there if you want to have information on how to join. I believe it's free for TIA members. It might be free for everyone. I don't know. But Dean, you also have some other things maybe to get out of the way at the beginning of the show as well. Some appearances and some data.
Yeah, on the Landline Now show at 7 p.m. Eastern tomorrow evening. So that goes live Wednesday evening. And on the Radio Nemo show this coming Thursday morning at 8 a.m. with Jimmy Mack and Dave Nemo.
Great. I just like to sometimes get these things out of the way at the beginning because we forget at the end, we may lose viewers. So I just want to make sure we have a lot of really cool stuff going on. I want to make sure we talked about it. So with that, I'm going to dive into our key points of the week. So honestly, we could play Phil 3 or 4 slides with points for this week, given all that's going on. So a lot of volumes, right? Last week was brake check week, the last week of the week before. We're seeing volume surge ahead of Hurricane Ida. We have some fire risk out west, things like that. So that's pushing rates up a bit, kind of to correspond with the volumes. Ida's the big story nationally this week, at least on the domestic front, as that, that ripped through an area that's known for petroleum and chemical production. So it really remains to be seen what that impact is going to be on diesel long term. There's a lot of power outages. I think the entire city of New Orleans is pretty much still without power. That transmission tower fell into the Mississippi River with the 8 primary transmission lines heading in there. Maybe Dean has an update for us later in the program on that. But as of last time I checked, still a considerable amount without power. As a result, FMCSA granting exemptions for carriers in 6 states. And then just something to be aware if you are a carrier or a small fleet out there, truck stop closures in Louisiana, due to the hurricane. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dean to talk some more detail about what's going on out there. Dean?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Lots to cover this week. Of course, Hurricane Ida is taking a lot of the airtime at the moment, but there is a story developing on the West Coast that we'll cover in the next week or so. There's all sorts of records being set at the moment. If you remember back in February, there were 40 vessels at anchor February the 1st. That set a record for number of ships waiting to unload. It hit 44 on the weekend. It's now 47 as of yesterday. So there's 47 large container ships waiting to unload. Peak shipping season is here. Volumes coming in the next couple of weeks, looking at TMS systems based on what's on the water. Volumes look like they'll be up next week about 20% year over year. And the week after, they'll be up 60% year over year. So peak shipping volumes are certainly going to be the big story in coming weeks. But here locally, lots to cover on Hurricane Ida. Dry van load post volumes took off last week. They always do in the second week before Labor Day. But Hurricane Ida last week making landfall bumped up some volumes inbound and outbound of the New Orleans market. We had a look at equipment posts. Brake safety week had a very minimal impact last week. It doesn't generally have an impact in years where spot rates are high. For obvious reasons, carriers keep rolling while the rates are good. But in down years, there's more drivers that take time off. Load to truck ratio in dry van was up to 7.48 last week. So having a look now at our refrigerated load board activity, load to truck ratio moved up from 14.17 to 16.27. reefer shipping volumes jumped 10% last week. Equipment posts dropped by about 4%, so it moved up from 14.17 to 16.27. Having a look at the load board activity for flatbed, reversed trends last week. Seasonally, it was on its way down for about 7 weeks, but load post volumes shifted up last week by about 9%. I could see lots of inbound flatbed volume moving into Birmingham, Montgomery markets, obviously in readiness for the peak in hurricane season in September. Capacity tightened in flatbed slightly. There were 6% fewer equipment posts, so the load to truck ratio moved up to 48.46. So now moving over to the market condition index and having a look at our heat map. Generally speaking, the spot market found some energy last week. Shippers are obviously restocking a lot of depleted retail inventories ahead of the upcoming break. But adding to the volume surge last week was, of course, Hurricane Ida, and outbound volumes last week were up. Inbound volumes were up significantly last week in the spot market, up about 5% for dry van. Shippers obviously trying to get as much freight out of the way as they could before the storm hit. Outbound spot volumes were up 19% last week compared to the week prior. Outbound spot rates from New Orleans last week up 5 cents to an average of 2.44. Some lanes inbound to Houston had pretty tight capacity for obvious reasons. Spot rates from Houston to New Orleans were up 26 cents a mile to 2.65 on average. Having a look at the refrigerated market condition index, and of course perishables are always in the highest demand with any major hurricane event. Inbound reefer volumes into New Orleans increased by 18% last week. Temp control shippers were also very busy getting freight out of the way. Outbound volumes were up 25% last week, and outbound spot rates were down. So there's plenty of capacity as a result of the inbound volume coming in. Lots of trucks looking to get out of that market. Capacity was tight on some lanes. Dallas to New Orleans up 34 cents to 3.82 for refrigerated loads. Fort Worth to New Orleans up 11 cents to 3.46. And from the large warehouse market in Phoenix, loads were paying $3.04 per mile, representing a 37 cents per mile increase over the prior week. Having a look now at the flatbed market, in New Orleans, it's not a large flatbed market. There's a lot of inbound sort of furniture, coffee, lumber. So it's not a huge flatbed market. It only ranks 53 out of 135 of our flatbed markets. But generally what you see is when there's a hurricane season peak arriving, a lot of freight gets positioned into that market. So in the week prior to last week, there was obviously a lot more inbound flatbed volume. It was up 47% in the week prior before dropping back to normal levels last week. So it was looking like a lot of flatbed volumes of lumber and building materials were being positioned about 2 weeks out from Ida making landfall. Capacity was also tight last week on the inbound side. Rates were up 56 cents a mile on average to 2.22 for loads from Lakeland to New Orleans. Reno, Nevada, a lot of flatbed freight comes out of there. Rates are up 17 cents a mile to New Orleans, averaging 1.97. Having a look now at our year-over-year view of spot rates in the dry van sector, they were pretty flat for most of August, but they increased by 2 cents a mile last week to a national average of 2.45, excluding fuel, so up 2 last week. Compared to the same week last year, dry van rates are 40 cents a mile higher and about 65 cents a mile higher than 2018. In the refrigerated market, year-over-year view shows us that the spot market for reefer rates increased also by just over 2 cents a mile last week. The average was 2.79, excluding fuel, still 56 cents a mile higher than this time last year. And wrapping up with our flatbed year-over-year view, after decreasing for the prior 7 weeks, flatbed spot rates increased by just over 1 cent per mile to a national average of 2.63, excluding fuel last week. Still 41 cents a mile higher than the same week last year and 17 cents a mile higher than the same time in 2018. So that's it for our market update for this week. If you want to find out more about what's happening in the freight market, go to dat.com/market update and download our weekly report. With that, it's over to Ned for the short-term forecast.
Hi, everybody. So we're going to be starting off with the van short-term forecast. So you can see in blue the market rates observed by DAT, and then off to the right you can see our different forecast models. We have a short-term model in red, a ratecast model in green, and 2 blended forecasts in gold and silver that are mixtures of those 2 models in different ways and in different amounts. And you have to have very sharp eyes to see in the van chart the disagreement between these models, because there's kind of broad model agreement that their rates are likely to be trending up by about 5 cents heading into the later part of September. There's some structural stuff that there's little bits of disagreement. Ratecast is a little bit more bearish, with it expecting rates to stay lower for longer, whereas the short term is more of like a nice linear growth, as the short term model tends to like to do. This forecast, there's probably going to be some disruptions from Ida. So I would definitely be a little bit more cautious when we're heading into this next period, because these forecasts were run before Ida made landfall. Up next to the reefer, we can again see in blue the market rate observed by DAT. And then once more off to the right, you can see our different forecast models. Red being the short term, green being ratecast, and gold and silver being the two blended forecasts. Here, again, there's pretty broad model agreement. There's a little bit of discrepancy about the patterning of some seasonal and like week and month beats between the short term and the ratecast model. Ratecast is expecting rates to go up by about 5 cents through to the end of September, whereas short term is expecting things to hold about level. But overall, there's pretty broad model agreement about the direction and the shape of what's likely to be happening there. And once more, I will repeat that these models were run before Ida made landfall, and so be a little bit more cagey, because there's going to be a lot of disruptions, and it's really hard to predict the extent and the depth of these disruptions heading forward. Finally, we're heading into flatbed, and this is the one that I think is going to be the most subject to corrections post-Ida. Once more, these models were run before Ida made landfall. In blue, you can see the market rate observed by DAT. In red, you can see the short term, which is expecting the downward trend to continue. I don't really see that happening. In green, you can see the ratecast model, which is expecting a leveling off and then a raise back up as we head forward. I would expect much more of a sharp correction based on what's likely to be happening with Ida. And then the blended forecasts are kind of straddling the middle, expecting rates to more or less stay flat. But once more, please, as there's going to be a lot of disruption because of lane effects and the hurricane. And that brings us to the IQ question of the week. What freight impacts are we seeing from Hurricane Ida, and how long should we expect it to last?
I feel like there's only one person on this broadcast that can kick that off with any justice.
This is sort of one of those unfolding stories, Ken. I was watching the news this morning, and of course, there's still so many roads flooded, power lines down, truck stops closed. Something like 13% of our US oil production comes from that area. It was shut down over the weekend. So to the extent it takes them to get back online and people to get out of there, wherever they are, because I think one of the biggest challenges is a lot of people had to evacuate and they can't get back in. So that's going to affect the actual labour pool, even if the locations could reopen. I spent a lot of years working in that area. A lot of carriers down there call it gasoline alley for a very good reason. That traffic volume on the I-10 is substantial. There's a lot of chemical plants, a lot of oil plants. So disruption to anything like that, I think, is going to have a profound effect. I think the refineries that got shut down over the weekend represent about 20% of our exports to foreign countries. But there's also a lot of pipeline oil that comes out of that region. You'll remember the story recently about the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack. That's the same pipeline that moves most of that fuel out of that region. So I think this is a story that's going to evolve over the course of the week. But I think some of our data last week showed that there was a lot of volume moved out of the market, and truckers will try to move as much volume as they can into the market when they can. And I think the major interstates, it looks like some of the interstate exit ramps were blocked off and or flooded or damaged. But I think there's a lot of damage to secondary roads. So that'll slow a lot of truckload capacity down. But it will pick up, I think, once they start to get through by the end of this week, they'll have a good sense of how they can get in there. It's one of those evolving stories that's hard to really say how much impact there is, because they're still in search and recovery mode right now.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that when you have a disaster of this magnitude, like the depths of it are really not going to be known until after a couple of more days at least have passed.
Yep.
Yeah, I think there's like some practical tips to always apply during these things, which is if you understand how FEMA kind of goes out and taps into the capacity pool, it makes perfect sense that that's going to tighten things up for reefer and dry van at the moment, at least short term.
Yeah.
The heavy stuff coming in on flatbeds may take a while a lot of that area is still flooded at the moment or without power. So they're tarping. They're not rebuilding yet, obviously. So understanding that things might get tight. If you're a broker or a shipper, understanding you might have a carrier that is going to pivot to haul some of those FEMA loads, not only because of the high price, but right. I mean, it's a noble thing, I guess, to do, right? If you think about it, to be able to help, and the side benefit is they pay very, very well. So that's going to be a very real and is currently a very real capacity constraint in and around that area. I wouldn't expect it. I mean, if you have a regional carrier in the Pacific Northwest, I wouldn't be as worried about it. It's going to mainly be, I'd say, as far west as Texas, as far north as Kentucky, Tennessee area, and then all the way heading out to the East Coast. That sort of expanded southeastern region is going to be locally constrained for capacity as a result of this, I would say.
Especially power-only capacity, Ken. I think there's a lot of FEMA trailers get positioned and then sit in those areas like that Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, where they store a lot of trailers in advance. I looked at some of our spot volumes for dry van and flatbed into that particular market. They were up 5 times in the week before last. So there was a substantial increase in inbound spot market volume 2 weeks ahead of Ida making landfall. And of course, that preparedness didn't have Ida in mind because it hadn't formed yet in the Atlantic. But I think that's well known that the peak in hurricane activity is September. And what I've been seeing is a lot more preparedness this time around. I think we've got a lot more visibility into the market. People like Kathy Fulton over at Allen Aid, who did a wonderful job in helping the market understand where the most need is. So I think the market was well prepared, but of course there's the biggest difficulty, of course, now is physically getting trucks in to unload freight that's in the biggest need. So, but that's not a new news story. That's always the case in events like this.
Yeah, I mean, not to be a downer on a Tuesday morning, but I was reading a story yesterday morning that said, typically, right, so FEMA will stage refrigerated trailers with necessary medical supplies, some emergency foodstuffs, medicine, things like that, right outside of the projected impact area, store them there running, keep them gassed up and running, and then move them in once the storm passes. They've had trouble getting those trailers because of all of the hospitals and medical centers across the country using them for COVID support, both as temporary themselves using it for medical supply storage and whatnot, but then also temporary morgues, which is not an overall cheery thing to think about. But again, drawing the parallels to 2017, right? We had an impending constraint with ELDs in that December, and then Harvey and Irma hit in that same year, which sort of kicked off a disruption. This is something we're seeing that's unique in that a potentially active tropical season at the peak of a disruption, already with shortages, already with supply constraints. Port congestion. Now, I know there's not a lot of interchangeability between Houston and LA Long Beach from a port perspective. You're talking about mainly an oil port versus mainly a container port. But still, limiting options, right? Think about the traffic that was forestalled going east through the Panama Canal. Like, even to get to Savannah, most of those boats, Dean, probably went out a bit into the Gulf and waited for the storm to pass before continuing on to Savannah or whatnot, or Jacksonville.
Yep, they did.
So, again, adding days adds a lot of inefficiency and congestion further down the timeline, right? Adding an extra day of sea travel could have major ramifications downstream, especially if you start adding 2, 3, 4 days, right? Because then boats start piling up. They don't have their scheduled dock time and unloading resources and the drayage capacity. We're already extremely pinched for warehouse capacity and cross-dock capacity. So again, any stress on the system, even if it is local, can impact the whole system at this point.
Right. Yeah. And the depths of the, sorry, go ahead, Dean.
I was just going to say, don't forget that the train lines have also been closed down. Some of the major railroads can't get in and out of that particular area also. The port was closed. I read a great article on heavy-duty trucking this morning. They've got a great summary if anyone's interested on where the situation's at, but they were indicating that the port had still closed. So that's going to cause a massive backlog for all modes of transport for quite a few weeks. I think it's not the port of New Orleans is not a massive port in terms of import volume. Volumes were down in July, but I think to Ken's point, we had been seeing a lot more volume be redirected from the East Coast to Gulf Coast and East Coast ports. So, but that won't happen immediately. That'll take time for that to start to work its way into that market. But any disruption like this will have a significant backlog effect on all modes of transport, notwithstanding all the delays we've already got on the intermodal lines. But I think truckload's probably the most resilient, the most flexible, the most adaptable. It'll get in there and move those volumes pretty quickly once they physically get.
Yeah, I mean, and then again, not to stay on the malaise train here, the melancholy train, but we have fires burning out west. Ned has some data on that to update us with.
Oh boy. Yeah, no, Tahoe is being evacuated. So if you're the kind of person who happens to have folks around Tahoe, I would definitely be aware of that. In Oregon, it's not so bad. There's still some uncontained fires, but most of them are not right now in any kind of a path for harm's way. But yeah, no, California is looking like it might be a little rough for the next period, but it's probably not going to impact shipping as much given the location, just human beings.
Yeah, but I mean, potential future demand for building supplies and things like that. Again, any diversion of resource, and I know, so this would have been a much bigger story, I think, in the freight economy 4 months ago, when you still couldn't buy 2x4s or they were $10 a piece. Most home improvement stores, at least out our way, have stacks and stacks of OSB and dimensional lumber now. So I don't know that it'll be as big of an issue, but it could set off another. I mean, it's not like we've stabilized into a nice, firm standing back to where things were with building materials and supplies, right? We're in a very precarious position. And
so, Ken, I was talking to some friends of mine that run flatbed lumber out of Quebec and northern Maine. There's a lot of really good softwood lumber comes out of that area for the US housing industry, mostly the residential housing industry. And one thing I noticed was an increased volume because, when you just talk to them and you see where they are each time of the week, you can see that their cadence has been upped. And if you sort of connect all the dots, you can see this a lot of lumber being positioned into those southern markets. Southeast, about 55% of all single-family homes get built in the south region. Wind events tend to damage a lot more single-family homes, so we see a lot more lumber being positioned there right now. And the effect it had on the overall market was it reversed a 7-week downward trend in spot rates and increased spot rates last week by about $0.01 per mile. Same thing out of Portland. A lot of lumber comes out of Portland. Flatbed capacity is pretty tight there. So I think I could see this market that's already very tight. It didn't take much to disrupt it because flatbed's not a huge part of the total freight task, but a very important one. And just a little bit of activity in the south region around hurricane preparedness looks like it pushed up national spot rates by $0.01 per mile this week.
Yeah, I mean, buckle up, right? I mean, we knew this was a potential. Hurricane season happens every year. It just so happens that, no pun intended, we have multiple fires burning all at once, right? Just to summarize before we move on to some questions, we have, I'm going to do them a little bit out of order. We have major port issues, right? I don't think we shouldn't really sugarcoat it. This is the time of the year when all the Christmas decorations, second wave decorations, I think most of the stores have some of them up already. And then all of the shelf stock, the imported shelf stock to support the holiday peak season on a boat or landing. So it's only going to get busier over these next few weeks, and we're already seeing major congestion. So that's really point one. Point two is there was obviously a major hurricane that impacted a rather populous area of the country and a rather important area from a fuel and general commodities, specifically chemicals perspective. So two things to think about there. One would be diesel, and diesel's already high. How does that what's that kind of impact going to be? And then part two, it's a somewhat, I wouldn't call it a major, it's like in college basketball, it'd be a mid-major shipping thoroughfare, right, Dean? I mean, it's not Atlanta to Chicago by any means, or LA outbound. So it's a mid-major. With already some interesting head haul, back haul dynamics, this will sort of impact that considerably over this week and the coming weeks. And then thirdly, keeping an eye on other disruptions, right? Whether it be the building materials sector, whether it be fires disrupting traffic out west. I mean, there is areas that fire could impinge upon if you look at a map. That's a somewhat popular warehousing area, kind of northeast of Tahoe, north, whatever that direction would be. So just keep in mind that. I think those are the 3 points. Did I summarize that pretty well?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, let's hit some questions here. We got a few coming in. Feel free to drop them below.
Yes.
We have at least 5 or 10 minutes here to answer questions. So if you have any, shoot them our way, and we'll try to get them answered for you.
CJ asks, how do you expect the dry van market to change in the areas where the storm passed outbound?
I could take a crack at that, and then Dean can correct me. So you saw this big rush to get equipment out. So to get the stuff in, and then as happens with every storm, get the stuff out. I think as the main primary need over the next few weeks is going to be freight coming in, right? So whether that be relief supplies, food, restocking shelves, things like that. It should take a few weeks to really jumpstart any production that did exist there that needed to come out. So I would expect the backhaul market coming out to be rather dismal for the next few weeks, but the head haul market, the head haul lanes coming in to be very strong, way stronger than you would seasonally anticipate. But what do you guys think?
Agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, Ken, that's provided they can get the inventory. The pictures over the weekend of completely bare shelves made me think about just the difficulties retailers have had in just stocking shelves, even without a disaster like this. I think that'll be a real challenge for distributors, is actually finding the volume to restock quickly.
That's a good point.
So yeah, don't expect anything great coming out. Peter Austin asks, is it better to get loads direct from FEMA, or will DOT pay a similar rate?
So first, I'm assuming this is what you meant, but just to clarify for some of our listeners, DAT doesn't pay any rates, right? I think what he's talking about is rates he might find on the DAT board. Yeah.
Sorry. I thought it was DOT, the Department of Transportation, but no. Please.
No. So I think when we talk about that, the loads will come directly from FEMA or contract carriers that FEMA works directly with, right? So let's just say you might be leased onto a fleet, or Dean, I don't know. Do any carriers? I don't want to speak out of turn here. Do any of I don't want to say them by name. Well, I'll just say them by name. So would Landstar kind of inject any of their FEMA loads into their system, or would they sort of keep them only to their exclusive fleet?
That's a great question. I actually don't know that, Ken.
That's a good one, Peter. We handled a lot of FEMA loads when I was in the industry, but we had an exclusive leased fleet. They couldn't run for anyone else, right? They ran under our authority. So they were contracted exclusively to us, and we would only offer the loads to them. We would never post a load out, a FEMA load out to external capacity that I was aware of. And if we did, it would only be to very, very trusted carriers that we had dedicated relationships with, I would say. But I'd be very surprised if you found one of those floating around on our load board. I'd actually be very interested. If you do, send it over to us, because that's something I'd be really interested in kind of taking a peek at. Ned, you've been here the longest out of all of us. Have you seen FEMA loads popping up on our load board?
Not really. There are the sort of ancillary stuff. So to the point that Dean was saying about store shelves, and once you get past the emergency supplies, those kinds of things will definitely appear on the board. But the FEMA loads themselves, I haven't really seen.
Yeah, that's more what I was kind of getting at, was the trucks hauling FEMA loads won't be available on the load board, hence constraining capacity locally. But It'd be we'll go back and take a look. Believe it or not, we can select all from load posts and see where customer equals FEMA. That's a joke. It's not that easy. Getting any data at DAT behind the scenes is like pulling teeth without Novocaine.
Peter Austin also asks, will backhaul out of the hurricane hit areas be crappy? I think we just answered that.
Yep.
Yes. If you were my son, I would very much thank you for not saying what you were thinking when you said crappy. But I would agree with both terms in varying degrees of harshness.
Peter Austin also asks, when you said capacity is affected as high as north as Tennessee, does that mean Tennessee to LA will pay better than Illinois to LA?
That's a great question. So explicitly, no. They won't. It doesn't necessarily mean that will be the case. I would say, let's just think about this for a minute. I would say I would expect higher than average rates going from Tennessee to Louisiana for sure. What I don't know is if there will be enough demand for that to spill over. If you're saying Chicago, if you're saying Illinois, you mean Chicago, regardless of like the latitude that I was speaking of, that very much trucks could get pulled from. It's that big of a market, right? Trucks could get pulled. I don't know if it'll be enough though, because there's so much freight going elsewhere from Chicago that you'll see kind of a macro impact on Chicago outbound as a result of just freight going from Chicago south. I think you're going to see again, and Tennessee's probably even stretching it. I would expect Atlanta to Louisiana to be very much affected. That'll probably be the largest impacted market, wouldn't you say, Dean?
Yeah.
Houston, Dallas. I'm trying to think. Even maybe Charlotte, kind of Charlotte coming down, where this would pull from. But I would say mainly like Atlanta, Memphis, maybe Kansas City, Dallas, and Houston. That would be like where I would draw my poorly done geographic arc. So from Dallas, Houston, Dallas, up kind of Kansas City, St. Louis, Memphis, over to Atlanta, and then maybe kind of terminating down.
Yep.
To Savannah, maybe.
I just took the spot rates out of Chicago to Atlanta, and I did notice this last week. There was a higher amount of volume being positioned into the Atlanta market. Of course, Atlanta is a major distribution hub for the Southeast. You've got a big chunk of the US population within about a day's drive. But on that lane, dry van lanes, Chicago, Atlanta, and I can almost connect the dots with a lot of congestion in the intermodal market in Chicago and volume being pushed over to truckload to refill warehouses in advance of hurricane season. Rates are up 90 cents a mile over the July average. They're at $3.83 today, excluding fuel. July average $2.91. So up about 90 cents a mile over the July average so far in August.
I need to go take a remedial geography course. I always forget how north Kansas City and St. Louis are. I would still expect it to pull from those markets because you're right. I think it's going to be those secondary markets that have some capacity to spare. Because rates are just so good coming out of Atlanta and Chicago right now. Why would you really? Right, because Atlanta is being impacted by Savannah being so busy from a container volume perspective, right?
Right.
And the whole drayage transloading issue there. Because it's not uncommon right now to have something come into Savannah, dray it to Atlanta, transload it, and ship it long haul, right? I mean, that's
right. Exactly.
It's kind of a mess. So I would expect those secondary markets like Atlanta or St. Louis, Kansas City, Louisville, Nashville, maybe that's kind of pushing it, Memphis. And then Dallas and Houston probably having a rather large impact. Depends on how jammed up Houston gets with tanker traffic, wouldn't you say?
Yep, exactly.
So this is all fun stuff. We have the tools to analyze this. So, if anyone's really interested in getting into the weeds, we can do another analytics segment where, if you remember that spider chart, we can actually stitch together in and outbound traffic and balance and how it's flowed through the hurricane. So if anyone's interested, drop a comment below and we'll add it to our list of stuff to talk about on upcoming shows. I think that balance chart would be really cool to look at pre and post hurricane. If you remember, it was the bubble charts.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, what do we got?
Eddie, two more. Eddie Smith asks, any thoughts on freight coming out of Ontario, California?
Yeah. Expect to pay a whole bunch. You have a really hard time finding a truck, and don't expect any kind of drayage or cross dock or transloading support. You're going to basically be waiting and paying.
Right. Yeah. The peak season volume is about to come in the next couple of weeks, but with the congestion there, I can see a lot more volume hitting our spot market. So one of the e-commerce benchmark lanes I watch is the 372-mile run from Los Angeles to Phoenix, where a lot of e-commerce warehouses are stored. Spot rates today, $4.42 per mile. So $4.42 excluding fuel. That's a 12-month record high, and we haven't seen peak shipping volume in Los Angeles just yet. So a lot more volume, a lot more loads. Rates should go even higher than that.
Right. So we had a question come in, which we could touch on a little bit, and we're running a little long, and that's fine. We've had some. We'll pay you guys back for the technical difficulties we've had over the past couple of weeks. So there's a. Can you explain the California market a little bit? So we'll touch on this real quick. Maybe Dean, Ned, and I can tag team it. But drop us a comment below if you would be interested. We've been toying around with the idea of doing more of like a screen share type show. Maybe not every week, but every other week, where we can really in real time answer your questions with visualizations that we have at our disposal. So we can look up lanes, outbound and inbound and balance and stuff in a way that we really can't do for this show. This show gets built once a week by our excellent production and support staff, and we can't really kind of go off script for this one. But if you guys would appreciate that kind of thing, we'd be more than happy to set it up. We just really haven't been able to, we haven't had the feedback that it would be something you guys would tune into. But if you're interested, let us know, and that would be really a good reason for us to at least take it for a spin. But California, really, really quick. The north and south half of the state are really two completely different beasts, right? And even really, it's kind of LA Long Beach. I know I don't want to get Dean on a roll here, but we could potentially break LA and Ontario into a couple different markets. Right now, we just lump it into LA and Ontario, but that is a market that is extremely impacted by the ports, LA and Long Beach. Most of that freight is going out and dispersing across the country, right? You can't go any further west unless you drive into the ocean, right? It's all going east. Some of it's going north, but the enhancement in the ports kind of the whole way up the West Coast has, over the last couple decades, minimized the amount of traffic that really goes north, right? You can bring things into Vancouver, Seattle, I guess even Portland to an extent. You have Oakland. Medford has a lot of what roll-off freight is that. Do I still have that correct? So, I mean, at the end of the day, really we're focused on Southern California when we talk about a lot of this California stuff. It's a huge railhead, so the cheapest way to move that freight would be to dray it to a rail car or directly load it onto a rail car as intermodal freight and ship it to Chicago, Atlanta, Texas, wherever you're moving. But right now, that's extremely constrained, extremely constrained in all facets, right? They don't have chassis. They don't have the support to get it offloaded on the boat. The railroads are embargoing freight there, putting extremely high surcharges if you're not a contract shipper. So more and more people are forced to use over the road, which is inherently more expensive. And as a result, more trucks have to get there. And the only real way to get there right now, there's not nearly as much freight coming into Southern California on a truck as there is leaving. So they come in empty. So they have to pay for those empty miles, which is even driving rates further up. So when Dean or I or Ned say a round trip rate, what we mean is essentially you're paying for them to come back empty on your loaded shipment coming out. So again, each one of those little things I covered, and I'll turn it over to Dean and Ned here in a minute, could be a 10 to 15 minute discussion about the intricacies of kind of intermodal savings and transloading and that kind of stuff. But Dean, did I miss anything from like a macro perspective of what we think about with California?
I'd just add that about a third of all of our imports in the US come into this little area that's got a couple of miles of port, space. So it's a very heavily congested part of Los Angeles. But think about a third of our import volume comes in there and then has to find its way onto a train or a truck at some point to move further inland. So it's a major origination point for a lot of truckload volume, a lot of intermodal volume. One of the primary intermodal lanes is Los Angeles, Chicago. And what you'll see is that as that becomes more congested, there's a lot more volume comes onto the truckload side to move that freight further back to the east. So it's a pivotal hub. On the refrigerated side, about 60% of all of our fruit and veggies in the country come from the area just north of Ontario through the Central Valley there in the Fresno market. So it's a huge refrigerated market. It's also a massive warehouse market around Ontario. The Inland Empire is a major airport, a major market that we watch because a lot of that warehouse volume that comes in from the import side finds its way to the Ontario market, both on train and truck, before either getting transloaded into a 53-foot road trailer or intermodal unit, depending on the shipper's destination requirement.
Yeah, the only other thing that I'd mention is that Northern California there's not the same dynamics quite in play, but there are just like a lot of folks and a lot of density there. And so there's a lot of demand for trucks up there. But, yeah.
I misspoke, Dean. I said Medford. Medford's inland. What port? Does Portland have a lot of the roll-off rate? Where is that? Where's most of that roll-off stuff happening on the West Coast? I mean, Medford's not even near the water, right? They totally whiffed on that.
Yeah, no, it's not in Portland. Yeah, Portland, you get some like bulk goods, but not so much roll-off.
I'll have to
They
research
just moved up to Vancouver, given the intermodal infrastructure that's been built out there, the train infrastructure, the rail infrastructure.
I mean, there's some rail. There's a non-trivial amount of rail in Portland. There's a UP marshalling yard there, and you do get some, but you're having to go by river to get into the port of Portland, and so you don't get a lot of like really heavy depth ships. But
Right. All right, one more.
all right, boy, Michael Morrison asks, Dean, as a principal analyst, when you mention the current market reefer rates excluding fuels, does that mean that this rate is in addition to the current fuel prices?
Yeah, if you understand the question right, yes, it's excluding the fuel. So you'd have to add the fuel surcharge onto that line haul rate.
And we do that because we want to see changes in fuel different from changes in line haul, correct? So if rates are dropping, if you only report the all-in rate and rates are dropping or increasing, 2 weeks off, that could be fuel or that could be line haul or some combination of both driving that. So we like to split them out because really the market dynamics have no impact on fuel. That's all commodity driven. So we'd like to just study the baseline haul price.
And it's different in every region, right? You've got all the different
PADs.
fuel regions, the PAD regions, so you can have vastly different fuel prices at the retail level.
Cool. Well, hey, it was great to be back in our kind of normal setup here. It's a thing of comfort, knowing it's generally going to work. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, Dean has the appearances he mentioned, the Landline and the Nemo show. We have the TIA webinar here in an hour and 20 minutes. Again, if you're doing a lot of RFPs right now, we're going to be talking about some strategies based on industry experience and the data we have available to us at DAT for doing that. And then any other housekeeping items? If you didn't tune in last week, the DATCon in Austin has been canceled. Anything else, folks?
Freightvine, got the Freightvine podcast coming up.
Oh, yeah. I listened to that on the plane. Chris had Carrie Byrne on, CEO of TQL. Really great. You're just kind of talking about they're the second or third largest broker out there right now. Really great sit-down conversation. I don't know who he has coming up next, but again, always a good listen. All right, with that, we're going to sign off. We will see you most likely next week. We haven't made a determination. It's Labor Day coming up. 50-50 chance we see you next week. But if not, we'll definitely catch you the week after. Have a great week, everyone. Bye.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.